In the ruthless world of organized crime, trust is everything. But when that trust is broken, the consequences are deadly. Salvatore Costa, a feared and respected mafia boss, was sentenced to life in prison for murder. Before his arrest, he secured his fortune millions in cash, hidden away where only he knew. Years later, his former allies begin turning up dead. Whispers spread through the underworld. Costa is back, hunting those who betrayed him. But there's one problem: he never left prison. So who's carrying out his revenge? And what dark secrets lie buried beneath the bloodshed? Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime. Salvatore Costa ruled New York's criminal underworld with a mix of brutality and calculated strategy. His empire spanned drug trafficking, extortion, and illegal gambling, bringing him immense wealth and unshakable influence. He was more than a crime boss, he was a legend. Enemies feared him, allies respected him, and law enforcement struggled to take him down. But power breeds enemies, and even the most untouchable figures are vulnerable when betrayal comes from within. In 1998, Costa's reign came to an abrupt and brutal end. Someone close to him had turned. The FBI had airtight evidence, witness testimony, and enough leverage to put him away for life. A conviction was inevitable, but Costa had spent years preparing for the possibility of betrayal. He had one final move left, a secret that would keep his enemies restless long after he was gone. Before his arrest, he vanished millions in cash money he had siphoned from his empire and stashed away where only he knew. The rumors spread like wildfire. His fortune was hidden somewhere, waiting for the right hands to claim it. His most trusted associates, men who had once sworn loyalty to him, began searching for it. Whispers of secret codes, maps, and hidden clues spread through the underworld. Some believed he had entrusted the location to a single person, while others thought he had left cryptic instructions behind. What no one wanted to admit was the truth: Costa never intended for anyone else to find his money. As the years passed, the tension among his former allies escalated. Vinny Rizzo, once Costa's right-hand man, became obsessed with uncovering the hidden millions. Frankie Bellini, another high-ranking figure, started making bold moves, assuming leadership in Costa's absence. The balance of power was shifting, and the desperate hunt for the missing fortune turned former friends into rivals. The very men who had once worked together were now at each other's throats, driven by greed and paranoia. Costa, locked behind the thick walls of a maximum security prison, watched from a distance. Through the few visitors he was allowed, he learned how his so-called allies were tearing each other apart. The loyalty they once promised him had crumbled the moment he was no longer in power. They had abandoned him, betrayed the oath they had once sworn, and now they were fighting over something that was never meant to be found. For 2 decades, the legend of Costa's missing fortune remained an obsession in the criminal world. But no one ever found it, and those who searched too aggressively, those who dug too deep, often disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Whether they were eliminated by competitors or simply ran out of luck, one thing was certain: searching for Costa's money was dangerous. Then, in 2019, the bodies started turning up. The first body sent shockwaves through the underworld. Vinny Rizzo had been one of the last remaining figures from Salvatore Costa's inner circle. For years, he had kept a low profile, avoiding the chaos that followed Costa's downfall. But in early 2019, his luck ran out. 2 bullets to the back of the head, executed in his own home. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The only thing that remained was the undeniable message: someone was settling scores. It was the mark of a professional, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The murder felt personal. This wasn't a random hit, it was an execution. A message. But from who? The old Mafia families had mostly moved on, shifting their focus to new business ventures. Vinny had no known enemies left, at least, none that would go after him after all these years. And yet, his death was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, Frankie Bellini was found dead in the trunk of his own car. The scene was brutal: his hands bound, his throat slit, his body dumped like garbage. It was a calculated execution, not the work of a random hitman. Whoever was responsible was moving methodically, eliminating Costa's former associates one by one. The similarities between his murder and Vinny's were impossible to ignore. Both men had been close to Costa. Both had searched for his hidden fortune, and now both were dead. Panic spread through the underworld. The whispers started immediately. Someone was eliminating the old crew. Someone with a grudge. And there was only one name that made sense: Salvatore Costa. The rumors spread like wildfire. The timing was too perfect, the executions too personal. The whispers began almost immediately. Salvatore Costa was out. Some said he had escaped. Others believed he had struck a secret deal, quietly released under the radar. The idea seemed impossible, but fear overruled logic. But there was one problem. Costa was still locked away, serving out his life sentence without a single day of freedom. The man they feared had never left. So who was hunting his betrayers? And how far would the bloodshed go before the truth was revealed? Those who had once been allies were now looking over their shoulders, terrified that they could be next. Men who had spent decades in the business, who had built their careers on loyalty and survival, were suddenly vanishing into hiding. No one wanted to be the next body in a trunk. The authorities noticed the pattern immediately. High-profile murders in the criminal world were nothing new, but these were different. They weren't part of an ongoing war between rival factions. They weren't power grabs. They were calculated and precise, targeting a very specific group of men. Every victim had been connected to Costa. Every one of them had, at some point, tried to uncover his missing fortune. The FBI started looking into Costa himself, convinced that if he hadn't physically orchestrated the hits, he had at least given the order. But their investigation hit a dead end. Costa was still locked away, with no outside communication, no visitors beyond his lawyer. There was no possible way he could be involved. And yet, the murders continued. Fear turned to paranoia. The remaining men who had once sought Costa's fortune became desperate, trying to figure out who was behind the killings before they became the next target. Some fled the country, hoping to disappear before the executioner came knocking. Others started turning on each other, convinced that one of their own had taken it upon themselves to tie up loose ends. But the truth was even more chilling. Whoever was behind the killings wasn't just eliminating Costa's betrayers, they were following a plan. A methodical, relentless campaign that showed no sign of stopping. And as the body count rose, one thing became terrifyingly clear. Whoever was doing this wasn't just seeking revenge. They were sending a message, and no one knew how many more would have to die before that message was fully delivered. The killings had become impossible to ignore. What had started as whispers in the criminal underworld had turned into a full-blown crisis. Bodies of Salvatore Costa's former allies were piling up, each murder more precise, more brutal than the last. Fear gripped those who had once walked beside the legendary crime boss, forcing them into hiding. But the question remained, who was responsible? The answer, law enforcement believed, had to lie within the underworld itself. Detective Lauren Mitchell had spent years studying organized crime, tracking the rise and fall of figures like Costa. She had seen power shifts before, but this was different. There was no clear motive beyond revenge, no sign that another family was trying to take control. These murders were personal. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Every victim had been involved in the search for Costa's missing fortune. Someone was tying up loose ends, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. The first lead came through surveillance footage near Frankie Bellini's last known location. A figure had been seen entering his building just hours before his death. The man was careful, keeping his face turned away from security cameras, but there was something familiar about him. Mitchell cross-referenced names with known Costa associates, and one name stood out: Luca De Lorenzo. Luca had been a small-time enforcer under Costa, never a major player but always loyal. After Costa's arrest, he had drifted from one crew to another, never making much of himself. He had no reason to be involved in these murders, no clear motive to take revenge. But something had changed. Witnesses reported seeing him meeting with several of the victims before they died. He was careful, but not careful enough. Mitchell's team tracked Luca's movements in the weeks leading up to the killings. His routine had shifted. He had been seen visiting locations tied to Costa's old empire, talking to men who were now dead. He wasn't just connected to the victims, he had been close to them in their final days. It seemed obvious Luca was the killer, but something didn't add up. Luca had never been more than a foot soldier. He wasn't a strategist, wasn't known for making big moves. If he was carrying out these hits, he wasn't doing it alone. Someone was giving him orders. Someone with the knowledge, the connections, and the motive to see this through. Mitchell dug deeper, searching for any sign of communication between Luca and a higher power. But Costa had been in solitary confinement during every single murder. There were no recorded visitors, no intercepted messages, no indication that he had been in contact with anyone outside his prison walls. The idea that he could be orchestrating this from behind bars was impossible. And yet, the murders were following a pattern too precise to be random. Luca's arrest was inevitable. When authorities finally tracked him down, he had already gone into hiding. He must have known the net was closing in. But when he was finally brought in, something unexpected happened. He refused to say a word. He didn't deny the murders. He didn't offer a defense. He simply sat in silence, a hint of something almost like satisfaction in his eyes. Mitchell pushed for answers, but none came. The evidence was strong enough to charge Luca with at least 2 of the murders, but something still felt wrong. He was playing a part in this, but he wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't capable of planning something this calculated. He was carrying out orders. The problem was, the only man who should have had the power to give those orders was still behind bars, which meant someone else was pulling the strings, someone who had been watching, waiting, and ensuring that every last one of Salvatore Costa's enemies paid the ultimate price. Luca de Lorenzo had been arrested, but the killings didn't stop. That was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Law enforcement had expected the murders to end with his capture, believing him to be the lone assassin carrying out a personal vendetta. But just days after he was taken into custody, another body surfaced. Paulie Marino, another of Salvatore Costa's former associates. His body was found dumped in an alley, a bullet in his skull, executed in the same calculated fashion as the others. Detective Lauren Mitchell knew then that they had only scratched the surface. Luca had been involved, but he wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn, following orders from someone still on the outside. The question remained: who had the knowledge, the resources, and the drive to finish what had started decades ago? There was only one name that made sense: Salvatore Costa. But Costa was still locked away, his every movement monitored, no access to the outside world. Law enforcement had searched for any sign of secret messages, hidden communications, or corrupt officials aiding him from within. They found nothing. The idea that he could be directing the killings from his cell defied logic. Yet, the pattern was undeniable. The investigation took a new turn. If Costa wasn't communicating directly, then someone was acting on his behalf. Someone who still had access to the underworld, someone with the loyalty to carry out his vengeance without hesitation. The search led back to Costa's past, to the people who had stayed loyal even after his downfall. One name surfaced repeatedly: Adriana Costa. Few ever spoke of her, but those who did knew she had been more than just Salvatore's wife. She had been his silent partner, the one who had stayed in the shadows while he built his empire. Many had underestimated her, seeing her as nothing more than a mobster's wife, but those close to Costa knew better. Adriana had always been just as ruthless, just as intelligent, but far more patient. She had disappeared from public life after Costa's imprisonment, retreating into the background while the criminal world turned on itself. But while others fought over his empire, she had been waiting, watching, letting the men who had betrayed her husband grow comfortable, letting them believe they were safe. Now, 2 decades later, she was making her move. Mitchell started connecting the dots. Adriana had never been officially involved in any of Costa's business dealings, making it impossible to tie her to the ongoing murders. There was no paper trail, no evidence that she had ever ordered a single hit. But those who knew the underworld understood how things truly worked. Power didn't always come from being at the center of the action. Sometimes it came from being the one pulling the strings from the dark. Witnesses who had once been uncooperative suddenly started disappearing. Informants who had once provided details on Costa's network went silent. Fear spread among the remaining men who had once been part of his empire, knowing that the reckoning wasn't over. But Adriana wasn't just finishing what her husband had started, she was ensuring that no one ever found the truth about his missing fortune. If anyone had known where Costa's millions were hidden, it had been the men now lying in unmarked graves. Whether they had ever been close to discovering it didn't matter anymore. The truth had died with them, buried under the weight of their own betrayal. Mitchell knew she was running out of time. Whoever was behind the killings wasn't going to stop until every last name on their list was crossed off. The only way to prevent more bloodshed was to find Adriana and prove her involvement. But there was a problem. There was no evidence, no witnesses willing to talk, no direct link connecting her to the crimes. And worst of all, no one knew where she was. Adriana Costa had spent decades living in the shadows. Now she was using that skill to eliminate anyone who had ever wronged her husband. And unless law enforcement found a way to stop her, the last of Costa's betrayers would soon be dead. The killings had reached their peak. One by one, every man who had betrayed Salvatore Costa had been eliminated. Those who had spent years searching for his missing fortune were now either dead or in hiding, too afraid to make a move. The underworld was in a state of paranoia, rumors spreading faster than the truth. Law enforcement knew that whoever was behind this wasn't just settling old scores, they were erasing an entire chapter of history. Detective Lauren Mitchell had followed the blood trail for months, watching it lead back to the same undeniable conclusion. Adriana Costa had been orchestrating the killings, but proving it was another matter. There was no evidence tying her to any crime, no direct connection between her and Luca De Lorenzo, the man they had arrested for the first wave of murders. If she had been the one pulling the strings, she had done it flawlessly. Mitchell wasn't willing to let the case go cold. She shifted her focus, searching not for evidence of the murders, but for something more valuable: Adriana's endgame. If the killings weren't just about revenge, then what was their true purpose? The answer had been in front of everyone all along: the missing fortune. Costa's hidden millions had fueled every betrayal, every death, every desperate act of greed. Adriana had waited years to wipe out those who had once hunted for it. If she had gone to such lengths to eliminate them, then that meant only one thing: she was finally ready to claim it for herself. Mitchell needed to find Adriana before she disappeared for good. The only way to do that was to think like her. Every murder had been precise, methodical. This wasn't the work of someone seeking momentary revenge, this was strategy. Adriana had followed a carefully laid out plan, one that had been in motion for years, and there was only one piece left: the money. The search led to a small, abandoned property on the outskirts of New York, a place that had once belonged to a man named Dominic Scali, a former associate of Costa who had died years earlier. His name had been lost in the chaos of Costa's fall, but Mitchell found records that placed Adriana there more than once. It was the only location that hadn't been torn apart by those searching for Costa's money. The property had long been forgotten, overlooked as an unimportant piece of the puzzle. But as Mitchell arrived, she knew she wasn't the only one who had figured it out. A black SUV sat parked near the entrance, engine still warm. Someone was inside. Mitchell approached carefully, her instincts screaming that she had found her target. She had no backup, no warrant, no official reason to be there. But this wasn't about the law anymore. This was about stopping a woman who had outplayed everyone, who had spent years orchestrating the downfall of the men who had once betrayed her husband. Inside the property, the scene was almost surreal. Dust covered every surface, broken furniture left untouched for years. And in the center of the room, Adriana Costa stood in front of an old wooden floor panel that had been pried open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Stacks of cash, still wrapped in plastic, untouched for decades. Adriana had found it. Mitchell knew she had no time to think. But before she could act, Adriana turned and disappeared into the shadows. By the time Mitchell reached the open floor panel, the SUV outside was already speeding away. The fortune had been recovered, but the woman behind the killings had vanished. No fingerprints, no trace, no evidence that she had ever been there. Adriana Costa had done the impossible. She had taken down every last one of her enemies, reclaimed the fortune, and slipped away without a single charge against her. The case would remain open, but Mitchell knew the truth. Justice would never catch up to Adriana Costa. The woman who had spent decades in the shadows had become something more than a fugitive. She had become a ghost, and just like the fortune she had fought so hard to protect, she would never be found again. The legend of Salvatore Costa continues to haunt the underworld. His enemies paid the price for their greed, but the real power was never in his hands, it was in the bloodline he left behind. What do you think? Was this justice, or just another cycle of violence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you love unraveling the darkest mysteries of true crime, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching Mystery Minds. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and stay safe.